Hello all, I'm Scarp SCS, but that's not important right now, as in this episode of Cogs, Gears and Optic Sensors, we are looking at none other than the Dinobots. Now, they're probably some of the most recognisable characters in the entire franchise, and they've touched just about every version of the brand, right up to Hasbro's current Cyberboard series. But despite being brought on board very early in the US comic, they were surprisingly underused, just due to the sheer volume of characters that Bob Budiansky needed to introduce. And that's where the weekly UK comic comes in. Because while the American book had to deal with the realities of a monthly publication schedule and the constant need to introduce new characters from Hasbro's ever expanding toy line, the UK comic had a very different problem. It needed to fill a new issue every single week, which meant it very, very quickly burned through the US material available to reprint, and that gave Simon Furman an opportunity. He could take characters who hadn't been particularly active in the US book and actually give them something to do. What Furman is effectively creating here is an anthology epic, one larger story with a common thread, but each installment is able to stand on its own. It's a format he'd return to repeatedly, in stories like Matrix Quest, Perchance to Dream, and Aspects of Evil. So after the events of the Icarus Theory, the Autobots have discovered that the Dinobots have reverted to their more primal instincts. So Optimus Prime has a problem on his hands. There are four extremely powerful Dinobots running around somewhere in North America, and they aren't exactly in a particularly rational frame of mind. It's time for a Dinobot hunt, which begins in the Nevada Black Rock Desert. Three soldiers are investigating some rather unusual objects sticking out the sand, except they turn out to be Snarl solar collectors, and unfortunately for them, Snarl is still attached. And when one of the soldiers decides to investigate by cutting into one of these mysterious spikes with a laser saw, the predictable happens. Snarl wakes up and is not particularly impressed. The soldiers are soon running for their lives as Snarl tears through the desert. See, Dinobot Hunt opens by immediately establishing the problem Furman has created for himself. These aren't the Dinobots we remember for the cartoon. They're effectively animals wearing the bodies of some of the most powerful Transformers on Earth. And the Autobots have to find a way to stop them before somebody gets killed. In a flashback, Optimus Prime and Prowl brief the teams on exactly what they're dealing with, which are none other than Grimlock, Slag, Sludge and Snarl. Each one has a particular strength, which makes them extremely dangerous, cleverly tying back into their toy bios. Grimlock's jaws can cut an opponent in two, Slag is fast, ferocious, and can breathe fire. Sludge is particularly dangerous in water, and Snarl, of course, well, his strength increases dramatically in sunlight, which makes the Nevada desert a particularly appropriate place to find him. The problem is that Snarl isn't exactly seeing things clearly. His vision is, say, well, less than perfect. Whether that's because of his condition or because he simply needs an appointment with Specsavers is open to interpretation. Snarl's condition means he can't distinguish friend from foe, and when Mirage's team tries to bring him in, things inevitably go sideways. Snarl disappears into the storm and heads west, straight towards something the Autobots weren't expecting to find. A military base so secret that it officially doesn't exist, and its commander is one General Carl Thompson, a rare Transformers military character given both a first and last name. Now, one of the things I particularly like about this first chapter is that Furman doesn't make the military presence the predictable obstacle. Carl Thompson is actually bored with his secret installation. He's been ordered to develop a weapon he doesn't particularly like, and then a giant robotic dinosaur turns up and gives him an excuse to blow the whole place up. He's a surprisingly fun little character, and it's a shame this is effectively the last we'll see of him. It's also something Furman does surprisingly well throughout Dinobot Hunt. He'll introduce something that looks completely familiar and just give it that slightly different angle. There's also something else I really like about this opening chapter. It's not simply, look how brilliant and powerful the Dinobots are. The Autobots actually get to do their jobs. Mirage, Brawn and Trailbreaker work together as a team, and it's particularly nice to see Trailbreaker getting some spotlight. Marvel never exactly made him one of their most prominent characters, so giving him a proper role here is really welcome. And this is something Dinobot Hunt does quite well. The Dinobots might be the stars of the story, but the supporting characters aren't simply just standing around waiting for them to do something. They aren't just there because plot. There's even a little bit of unintended comedy in Optimus Prime's briefing. As he explains the situation to the various Autobot teams, holograms appear to illustrate exactly what he's talking about, which makes perfect sense until he gets to the part about protecting humans, at which point we get a hologram of a human, just in case the readers or the Autobots weren't entirely sure what one looked like. The chapter ends with another character quietly watching everything that's happening, none other than Laserbeak. And that tells us that this isn't going to remain an Autobot rescue operation for very long. Now, the second chapter takes us across the country to Northern California, to something we're told is a vast inland waterway and popular tourist destination. And looking at the artwork though, I'm not entirely convinced I'd be booking my summer holiday there.
Nothing beats a Jet2 holiday.
And something else has arrived in the area, none other than the Decepticons. Now, we don't immediately find out who they are, which gives the story a little mystery. They're questioning the locals about reports of a monster in the swamp. Meanwhile, the Autobots have sent yet another team to investigate. This one is Gears, Cliffjumper, and Windcharger, the A-Team. No, not that A-Team. Although, considering the year, I'm not entirely convinced Furman wasn't having a little joke here. Now, they're looking for Sludge, who is very nearby. Only, unlike Snarl, Sludge isn't particularly interested in smashing anything. His condition has left him almost completely docile. He's wandering around the swamp, happily munching on vegetation, and he's also attracted the attention of a television reporter named Joy Meadows. Meadows sees Sludge as the story that could finally make her career, which is actually one of the more interesting aspects of this part. And I think it's worth highlighting because Marvel's human supporting cast hasn't exactly been its strongest point so far. Meadows could have easily been another disposable character whose only purpose is to react to whatever Transformer happens to be standing next to her. Instead, she has her own agenda. She's interested in the story. She's spotted an opportunity and she's going after it. Now, it's a small distinction, but it makes her much more interesting than she could have easily been. And there's also some good stuff within the Autobots themselves. Gears, Cliffjumper, and Windcharger are much more relaxed than Mirage's team were in the previous chapter. They actually feel like three characters who are enjoying being together. At one point, Gears even ends up needing to be pulled out of the swamp using Windcharger's magnetic abilities. Cliffjumper gets to call out his glass gas gun, which is always nice to see. And the setting's also quite unusual for Transformers at this point. This isn't the California of palm trees and sunshine and built up cities. It's a proper swamp. And there are some very familiar adventure movie influences creeping into the story too. The swamp, the river chase, and even Cliffjumper's wisecracking use of his weapon all feel very close to the sort of Bond-style adventure Furman clearly loved. It's another example of him taking influences from outside Transformers and then dropping them into the story without making them feel like a parody. But Furman changes almost everything for this second chapter. We go from the Nevada desert to a California swamp, from an aggressive Snarl to a completely docile Sludge, and from a military installation to a TV reporter looking for a big scoop. The Autobots find Sludge lying unconscious. Joy Meadows has also been attacked. And before they have a chance to work out what's happened, the Autobots are hit by a volley of blaster fire. And finally, we see who's been behind all of this. Soundwave, Skywarp, and Scavenger. And I have to admit, seeing Scavenger turn up here is a particularly nice touch. The Constructicons hadn't exactly been getting a huge amount of attention, so bringing one of them back into the story is a welcome sight. It also showcases that something Marvel would do increasingly often that the cartoon wouldn't. Characters aren't necessarily restricted to their established groups. A Constructicon can turn up alongside Soundwave and Skywarp, and that's actually good for the universe. It makes the Decepticons feel like a wider group of characters rather than separate teams who only ever speak to their immediate colleagues, and it doesn't pigeonhole them. But more importantly, from the story's perspective, we've now seen what the Decepticons are prepared to do. They're not here to rescue the Dinobots, they're here to exploit them. And that's where this story suddenly gets much darker. Soundwave's team aren't threatening the locals or simply intimidating them. They're murdering them. It's a surprisingly brutal sequence for this early on in the UK comic, a kid's comic at that. And it immediately establishes that the Decepticons aren't treating the Dinobots situation as a rescue mission. And that's perhaps the cleverest thing about the first half of Dinobot Hunt. On paper, the structure is incredibly simple. Find a Dinobot, send a team after it, move along to the next location, rinse and repeat. But Furman uses each installment to change the tone, the setting, and even the supporting cast. Snarl gives us a desert adventure, Sludge takes us into a swamp, and suddenly introduces a much darker Decepticon threat. So rather than feeling like we're watching the same story 4 times with a different Dinobot, each installment gets to leave its own identity. And that's going to become a very important part of Furman's storytelling over the next few years. And that's perhaps the cleverest thing about the first part of Dinobot Hunt. But this is something the American book wasn't really in a position to do in the same way. The Dinobots had been introduced, they'd made an impact, and then because Budiansky had a huge roster to introduce, they largely disappeared. The UK comic didn't have that limitation in the same way. Furman could look at those unused characters and say, right, what can I actually do with these? How do I feature them? Well, we'll cover what he does with those next time. So, what do you think? Does this anthology style approach work for you? Or would you rather see one story run straight through from beginning to end? As always, let me know in the comments. As ever, thank you for watching along. If you liked this video, then please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. If you didn't like it, then leave one anyway. If you want to come and say hi on social media, then you can find me here. But whatever you do, folks, stay safe.